Okay, is this on? Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, Dana, I have noticed that almost every time you spoke, even at the highest level of the government, you would often begin with a poem. And so I wondered if you could begin this evening with a poem.
I'd be happy to. I mean, whenever I gave a speech in Washington, or actually of the thousands of speeches that I gave on the road, I would begin a poem if for no other reason than to shock people. But it seemed to me that if I was in charge of the arts in the United States, that one would want to begin any kind of public forum with a work of art. And it was hard to travel with sculpture. No one wants to hear me sing, and so
although you do write,
I write lyrics, but
yes.
I don't perform them. I did it, and I think it was interesting because I do believe that you make statements about things more strongly through your behavior than by all the opinions you give. So we were actually talking about Robert Frost this evening, and let me just recite a poem that you all know. And because poetry is a lot like song. The pleasure of poetry is like a song is to hear a song again and again, and it begins in a sense to speak to your inner life differently. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. But as for that, the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no steps had trodden black. Oh, I saved the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I would ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere, ages and ages hence, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference.
Thank you. We often talked about that, traveling, this divergent path, and often choosing the less traveled. And you grew up in Los Angeles. You grew up in a neighborhood that would not expect to produce a poet laureate. Can you tell us about that?
Hawthorne, my brother who grew up there with me always sends me articles about awful things from Hawthorne. He takes, as a graduate of Hawthorne High, he takes special joy in that. And we were happy that we were at the third poorest city in Southern California. I'm still rooting for number one, But it was a place. A lot of us come from odd places, and it was a kind of a poor, rough, kind of very ugly town. But it was what I knew, and I was living in apartments. I was surrounded by family. I went to 8 years of parochial school with my cousins, and the St. Joseph's Church there, thriving, crowded, overflowing church, and I was educated by the Sisters of Providence, and it was a good childhood. But the funny thing is that, and this I think gets to your point, is that it's a very ugly town. I mean, there's almost no nature. Everything was built very quickly after the Second World War just to house as many people as possible. And I had something inside me that I didn't understand, when I was younger, which was a hunger for beauty. I mean, I would walk blocks out of my way because there was one house that was kind of an older house that was sort of not bad looking. And I didn't understand it. It was just an impulse. And recognizing that hunger for beauty, which is a hunger for truth, for a hunger for meaning, for a hunger with a proper relationship between oneself and reality, that made all the difference, in Frost's, metaphor. But the trouble is, and I think this is really true, is that we have tens of millions of kids growing up in this country without access to arts arts education, without, in a sense, the experience with beauty that's going to help them articulate who they are, understand who they are in a natural way. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. And I was lucky to have Sister Camille Cecile, who gave me piano lessons. And, and she was the old tradition that believed in corporeal punishment as the best way of instruction, which, didn't bother me that much. I mean, but she had me playing Beethoven, by the time I was in 6th grade. She taught us free harmony lessons and things like that. And so I had this formation, and it was the one that was available to me. If you're poor in this country, you only get serious instruction in 2 things: sports and music. And those are, the avenues. And I was lucky that, and if you ever see me play a sports, you'll know that was not a good road for me, to have music.
I think this was a Stanford commencement address or somewhere like that, that you said that, a typical Los Angeles teenager can name the 5 starting players on the Lakers, but can't name a single poet.
No, it's true. I mean, if I took college grads and I asked them to name basketball players, football players, hip-hop artists, movie stars, comedians, they could just huge lists. If I asked them to name a single living novelist, poet, architect, sculptor, painter, theologian, philosopher, biologist, chemist, I doubt that you'd get maybe more than one name. And now that's bad for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's bad because what it means is we don't honor those professions in our society. But there's also something else, is that if I'm giving you models for how you want to lead your adult life, and your only models are people in entertainment, in sports, maybe a few politicians, I'm giving you a false picture of reality. I'm not giving you an adequate sense of the lives that you might lead that are worth leading. And I think that our whole society has, in a sense, become corrupted by money, celebrity, as if these are the 2 great tokens of a meaningful existence. And I kind of wonder now that Mother Teresa, is dead, buried, and thank God canonized. Who else do we even have like that in the whole world that we look up to, that people actually know? And so I think it's one of the many reflections of the impoverishment of our public culture, that we define merit, we define worth in our society in terms of dollars.
And your parents were not cultural figures in those terms, and your father was he
was a cab driver and he became a chauffeur.
And
then
your mother was
worked as an operator for Ma Bell, as it was called, back then.
From different cultures.
Yeah, my mother was Mexican, my dad was Sicilian. I say was because they both passed away.
The name Gioia means joy.
Gioia della vita per tu viti. So let me say something that bears repeating in our society. Poor people are not dumb people. You see intelligence and stupidity in every level of society. There's a few that you see more than you should, but we won't talk politics this evening. And so I came from a family of extremely intelligent, unsuccessful people. I think rarely has creativity, talent, and smarts gotten so little reward as in the Ortiz family and in the Gioia family. And I say this with all due respect. I mean, poor people tend often to be unlucky people. My grandfather came over from Sicily. My great-grandfather came up from Chihuahua, Mexico. He was promptly shot in a bar that he was tending during the winter in Lost Cabin, Wyoming. So I mean, so from the very start, bad luck, bad job to have taken to support a family, and so. But they were people that had lively imaginations. They were intelligent. Most of them had very, very good values. And so when I went to Stanford, it was the first time I didn't know anybody in Hawthorne, not anybody whose parents had gone to college. The priest had gone to seminary, and I guess when we went to a doctor, he had gone somewhere. But it was just, or at least had the certificate to claim he did. So it was, and suddenly went to Stanford, and like people were saying, like, my grandfather was the governor of this or judge, and I had to say, God, you mean somebody's grandfather was like a judge? And I realized, well, not everybody came up, just over in the boat from the old country, and I had to adjust myself. But on the other hand, I realized then that I had a really good childhood because my parents, had loved me and had given me self-esteem. And so many of these kids that I was with, some of whom had very, very famous last names and a lot of money, a lot of them didn't like their parents, weren't close to their families, they had no sense of who they were. So, I felt I had a pretty good start in life. And I had the Hawthorne Public Library. I had this library where I could go into, I could read books, anything I was interested in, I could study. So I sort of was an autodidact from a fairly early age. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I could go into business for 15 years and write at night, is I didn't need institutional support to do a lot of the stuff that I wanted to do. And I could sort of manage on my own. But, there's better places to start off, I think, than Hawthorne.
And you turned down the NEA chairmanship several times. They kept on coming back to you. And I remember you discussing this.
What insane people in person would want to head the NEA? In 2001. I mean, it was.
This is the height of culture wars. You said yourself that you were the sacrificial lamb the Bush administration offered to the culture wars. To the altar of culture wars.
Yeah. When I came into the NEA, there were two views of the NEA. The right looked at the NEA as the purveyors of smut and blasphemy. The left looked on the NEA as the lovable but inept purveyors of smut and blasphemy. And so, the conversation was not a conversation you really wanted to enter into. And so I refused even to interview. I mean, why give up your life as a writer? Why, go to Washington, D.C.
Great sacrifice.
And why try to pull this thing out of a morass?
And yet, when I talked to you about it, when you finally accepted, you talked about your father, that something that you desire to serve this country at this time in this capacity has something to do.
They picked this was all happening 3,000 miles away. I had no, I refused to go and interview for the job. They picked a great guy, Michael Hammond, terrific fellow, head of the Rice Music School, the Shepherd School of Music, and he dropped dead after 7 days.
On his way to Washington, right?
Yeah. Well, no, actually in Washington.
In Washington,
7 days after his confirmation. And if you've had the job, you'll know why that happened. It was a merciless, awful, amount of pressure. And I remember reading the paper saying, "Thank God I didn't, it's like saying, you want to be the first person to stick your head up at the Battle of the Somme, it's not a good career move." And then my father died. One of the reasons I wanted to stay in California is I was the only person that could get my father to go to a doctor's office, because he had a kind of peasant superstition. I'm going to go in there and I'm not going to come out. He didn't want to go. And so I saw my father through his last illness. He had actually a very gentle passing, and then 9/11 happened, and I was approached again, and I thought about this: is that my father had spent a lot of the best years of his life in World War II. Talk about insane jobs in a dive bomber. The radio operator in a dive bomber. I mean, the mortality rate in that job had to be about 60%. and he's got, in VJ Day, he was in a hospital, from his second crash. And I had never served my country. My country was at war, and I felt that I should step forward. I outraged presidential personnel, and it was an ugly scene. And I said I would take the job if the President of the United States, whom I had never met at that point, would give me his personal word of honor that he intended to rebuild the agency, and if he and I could agree on the right criteria. And this head of presidential personnel, this ex-investment banker, just went ballistic. And you can't demand that of the President of the United States, because he's used to people begging for jobs. And I said, that's okay. I won't take the job then. And he's yelling at me, and I said, well, thank you very much. I am leaving. And I walked out of the office, and he, that's when he probably began smashing furniture or something. And the rest of his staff were terrorized. I went back. I went back to California on Monday morning. I got a phone call, not from him, because he's not about to admit this, because when they told the president, they said, we want this guy. Now, I couldn't figure out why they wanted me. I'll tell you. Did I ever tell you why they wanted me?
I think you did several times. Yes, I do remember.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's because I didn't find out till years later.
But I know the people who.
Yeah. So anyway, and Monday morning they called up and said the president has given you his word of honor. He intends to rebuild it. I said, we have criteria, and this was 4 words. And this is when I knew he says, which was artistic excellence and education.
Yes.
And I knew that was the same answer I'd come up with. And so, I went off there.
And most people don't realize that George W. Bush meant that. And as a leader, he believed in that, and his wife believed in that.
They were never anything but true to their word. They were always there, when there were problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, the reason they wanted me, as it turned out, was that Mrs. Bush had read a book of mine that she really liked. Yeah. And George Bush loved the fact that there was a poet with an MBA.
Yes. Yes. And Laura Bush is a librarian.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that whenever they come back, well, what about this guy?
Right.
So anyway.
Well, I think it was more than that. But, I remember the early stage of that. And so I want to actually go over a few of the initiatives that you began, but I'm going to begin with one that you didn't begin. And you came in to Michael Hammond's vision of Shakespeare in American communities, and you took this and you ran with it as you was this your first major initiative, and what resonated?
Well, the thing about it was that everybody advised me that what I should do is nothing, just stay out of trouble and be invisible. And that struck me as, well, do you really have to go to Washington to do that? The only reason to have the National Endowment for the Arts is that it's worth something, that it's doing worthwhile work. So a couple months after I came out there, we astonished everybody by announcing the largest program in the history of the endowment, which was bringing Shakespeare on tour to all 50 states and eventually to the military bases.
And hiring out-of-work Shakespearean actors who need a job.
I've had a thing happen to me again where somebody will, like a waiter in a restaurant will say, "Are you Dana Gioia?" And I'll say, "Yeah." And I'll think it's because they know my poetry. And I'll say this, that, and they go, "No, I was an actor, and I got 43 weeks of work doing Macbeth, and I was able to live for 3 years off that money."
And this was mostly through regional arts agencies, which you built a relationship
we
with.
eventually had 90 companies, thousands of actors, directors, crew. We brought in millions. What we do is we would go to a town, we go to a theater, and we would fill half the seats with high school students, and the other half would be for sale. And so anybody who wanted to book it knew that no matter what happened, they would sell 50% of the seats. And so suddenly, we brought in millions of high school kids into the performance. For most of them, it was the first play they had ever seen. And the real beneficiaries, besides the kids, are the teachers, who for the first time are actually able to teach the kids a play they've seen, which completely changes the dynamics of the class.
I remember one time there was a report from one of the military bases that hosted Shakespeare in America, and the actors came in, didn't know what to expect, because the first time they ever had Shakespeare in a military base, they didn't know what the response would be. They were quite concerned anybody will show up, and the actor was saying that when they showed up, there were 5 Marine officers waiting for them to take orders from them, and they've never been the same again. They never had that situation before.
Let me just tell you about, this is just one little anecdote of this, which is that we were able to convince in a very complicated way that is a separate story and actually became a plot line in West Wing, to convince the Department of Defense to give us money to tour military bases. And the New York Times, which was always trying to do gotcha articles about me, but the reporters would come up, we'd talk, and the reporters said, these were good things. But this guy, the drama critic that was up there saying, why waste this money on bringing plays to the military? Yeah. These people, they don't want to see Shakespeare. And I said, I think you're probably right. I said, because you see, they can't understand it. You're probably right. I said, we're going to do Macbeth, and it's a play about a officer who kills his commander and seizes control of the army, and then seizes control of the country, which takes his officers and divides them into 2 groups who are trying to, in a sense, fight, for the winner, and all of whose families are at jeopardy. I said, they're never going to be able to relate to this. And he goes, oh, you're right.
And so many children in inner cities responded to your program, and because of that, they saw this line of stories, narratives that resonated with their own lives.
Yeah, I had a real simple philosophy: bring the best art possible to the widest audience possible, and put the people who get the least at the front of the line. And guess what? It worked. The public liked it. Congress liked it. The arts world eventually liked it, and even the press, realized that this it's bringing the power of art into people's lives.
And meanwhile, culture war is raging in D.C. There are lines, that people are staking out.
Oh no!
And,
it was.
This is a conversation that we're having at the NEA. Is a most generative conversation.
Well, when I was going off to Washington, a lot of my friends, very very arts people said, "Go there and fight. Go there and fight. The good fight." And I thought to myself, fighting. We live by metaphors. You pick an image for your life, a metaphor for your life, and it influences. Fighting is the wrong metaphor. What my job in Washington was reconciliation, to take people who are mad at each other, who don't trust each other, and bring them into an understanding that they actually agree on a lot of things. And the power of art in communities and the power of art in education seems to me something that's not political. People that have been involved in it see the power that this has in people's lives and in the lives of communities. People want to live in a town like Pasadena, which has museums, has good schools, has theaters, has all of these things which essentially give richness to life.
And you went to senators and House members, and you reminded them that they were once Shakespearean actors. So I remember this photograph, I think it was, of a very conservative senator standing next to a very liberal senator. They were both in same play in high school or something like that.
There was no trick too hokey for us not to try. And one of the things, there's a lot of hams in politics. Hey, I'm a ham myself, and we would do these things, where we'd have all these things, and we'd ask some senators and congressmen and congresswomen to, don crowns and garbs and act out scenes from Shakespeare, and they loved it. And once
glorious.
They started, you can change somebody's mind more easily through experience than you can through argumentation. You give them, I mean, there was something I used to do with these, you know, if you're talking to a senator, he or she didn't get into office by themselves. There were people in their lives that were instrumental in awakening a big career. And one of them is always a high school teacher. Yes. And it's usually an English teacher who taught them the power of language. And so I would begin talking about Shakespeare, about, you know, bringing, you know, these things in school. And there was something I saw happen. And they would say, there was. And in the process of saying there was, their vocal tone would change, their body language change. And I knew exactly what the next words were. There was this teacher in high school. And once I had him there, I knew we could, in a sense, relate through emotion and through experience and not through partisan politics. And, you know, one by one, you know, but sometimes didn't come to the senator. I came along with the senator for 6.5 years. Yeah. I spent maybe 3 weekends out of 4 traveling with congressmen, senators, back to their home districts, their home states, touring the arts, the schools with them, and showing them the good work that the NEA did.
And some of the senators and House members were fascinated by jazz, so they played themselves. And so you brought the concept of Shakespeare in American communities, this idea of bringing this neglected form of art into the poorest areas, perhaps, and all of America. Yeah. And you did the same with NEA.
You go around the world and you ask, what are America's greatest artistic contributions? Overwhelmingly, 2 things: jazz and the movies. And yet jazz and jazz artists are not really honored in this country. A lot of them die in poverty, you know, without, any money, even medical care. So we created a program to honor great jazz musicians for their lifetime achievement, and also to send them on tour. So we would book them. Okay, and that was good for them, but it was also good because you would book them to like these jazz festivals that were, all of which were, you know, every jazz festival in the United States is on the verge of bankruptcy. But you bring Dave Brubeck in, somebody like this, and you book him for, you bring the NEA a grant where they can play one concert. Suddenly they sell out for the whole weekend, and the whole festival turns a profit, and 100 other musicians have paying work.
And we have Tony Bennett here, right next to Ray Barretto, and so many of these jazz masters will come out, even though they may not be the one being honored, but they would always come out. It was a family.
Yeah, for the things. I mean, we really, it was like a who's who every year. People would want to, come for the new class. We'd have these incredible concerts. We'd have, 20,000 people in the audience. It was a wonderful thing for the art.
And I remember one time you had invited the First Lady to come for the National Council meeting, and one of I think it was Percy Heath who played at that meeting, and this was a moment of revelation for me, because that was the first time that I felt this sense that what you were doing was not only fighting against something, but moving away from culture wars, language, but you're really caring for these people, because you had just announced that the Jazz Masters Award will go up from, I think it was $3,000 to $35,000. You made a decision to honor these legends who turns out they're having trouble paying rent.
I mean, some of them are quite well to do. Don't get me wrong. I mean, some of them have done well. Tony Bennett is not hurting. But a lot of them, I'll give you one story. I called, and I'm not going to give you the person's name, but it was one of the most famous bebop musicians of that jazz era. I called him up, told him he'd been chosen as a jazz master, and he started crying. And I figured, well, it's emotion. You're being honored. It's natural. He says, you got to tell my wife. I said, fine. So I tell her, and she starts weeping too. And they're both just weeping and weeping. And this is like more than I expected. Even if it touches you. And he said, and he comes back to the phone and says, you don't understand. we're being evicted from our apartment. And so some of it's honor, but some of it's, I think, a just reward for great contributions to an art in a society which doesn't necessarily reward you. America does not greatly honor its artists unless the artists are making lots of money. It doesn't provide livings for a lot of artists. Just think of the actors, the musicians, the writers. And I'm not saying everybody should get a free ride, but I do think we should honor achievement. People who have dedicated their lives to an art have done remarkable things. It might be nice if once in their life, their own government honored them.
And speaking of honoring those who sacrificed greatly for this country, we have many soldiers coming back from Afghanistan at the time and later Iraq. And you noted that many writers that we honor, that has written significant enduring works of fiction or essays in the past, like Hemingway, came right out of the front lines of wars. And you began this program, and the genius of this was to convince, what was it, Boeing, to pay for this?
This is kind of interesting to me. And it says something about our cultural assumptions, that the NEA had been going on for 37 years. It had done tens of thousands of grants, 100,000 grants, in fact, and it had never done a single program for anyone in the military. You've got 3 million Americans in the military or military families, and so when we did the Shakespeare tour, people said, well, they don't want it. This is above them, and I didn't believe that. I knew people who, because of the job options that were in their life, they went into the military, or they were paid their way through college in officer training and stayed in the military. So when the war broke out, I was talking to this woman. She was a poet laureate of Connecticut, Marilyn Nelson. Her father was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we're talking about how, at a lot of times when people are in the most crisis, in the most difficult situations of their lives, where the arts might actually provide some clarity, the arts are not available. And so we said, well, what if we could take the troops that are being rotated out of combat from Iraq and Afghanistan and give them the opportunity, if they wanted it, to sit down and write about their experience with real American writers, famous American writers. We had to convince the military, and that's a whole other story how we did this, to do it without censorship. They could do a security clearance on it, but no censorship of the opinions. And so we figured, it would be nice, nice small idea. So we announced it. We figured we'd do about 10, 12 of these seminars. Within hours after announcing it, all of the phones began ringing. We began, getting emails. The next day, we began getting FedEx packages. People were calling us on, satellite phones from, basically the battle areas, and we realized there was a vast demand for this. And we decided that we wanted to make it open not just for the troops, but for their spouses. You also had the first war where a lot of the spouses were men who were left, minding the kids. And so we had convinced Boeing for this tiny program, and we came back to them and said, it's going to need to be at least 10 times larger. And they were with us for years. And we ended up doing thousands and thousands of troops. And we had the best writers in the United States that were willing to, do it. So it was, I think it made a meaningful difference in the lives of these people, some of whom have actually gone on to become pretty well-known writers.
And speaking of big things, I'm going to actually skip this. We are running out of time. Let's talk about the big read. This is your biggest achievement as the NEA chair, and maybe most unlikely, but it came out of a longitudinal study that NEA did.
Yeah,
over,
this is not
years.
something we didn't intend to do, but we were doing lots of research on the role of arts and things like this. And we started looking at the decline in literacy, the decline in reading and reading ability in the United States, which was was inverse related to your age. The younger you are in this country, the less you read. And guess what? The less you read, the less well you read. And the less well you read, the less well you do in life. Not just in academics, but in jobs, even in civic involvement. Even in exercising, people who read exercise more than people who don't. That doesn't seem logical, but it is empirically demonstrable. And so we began trying to think, how could we create more reading? And we went through a number of ideas, and we came to the notion of this community-based program. What if you could get in a community everyone reading the same book for a month? Parent, student, grandparent, teacher. And so we created this program, which eventually became, it's the largest literary program in the history of the government, probably in the history of mankind. I don't know. There's not many literary programs that you have to compete with, unfortunately. And so we created, and by the time we were done, we had 25,000 other organizations that were partnering with us. We were in not just every state, we were in every congressional district, we were in pretty much every major city, and we had tens of millions of people involved with the program. And guess what happened? We felt that the reading had been going down constantly for 20 years. Reading ability had been going down. I thought the most we could possibly hope for was just to flatline. We actually increased literary reading in this country, but depending on what base you're using, by about 12 million people, and the reading scores began to increase. And so, see, what these programs do is just real something simple. I mean, you can actually change society for the better. You can change culture for the better. You can change education for better. People in the arts, people in culture, people in education are too used to telling stories with unhappy endings. What we demonstrated here is you can help create the society you want to live in. And this country, I think, has lost that confidence.
Thank you. Before I have you go up to the podium and read, I remember we were gathered in this Brooklyn loft long time ago. I think this was before you were the chair of the NEA. Otherwise, I don't think I could have gotten you there. It was a whole bunch of artists, and it was called the Renaissance Group. And it was because of Robert Emerson and Howard here that made it possible to have this gathering in Brooklyn with all these artists who loved the food because they needed to eat. But you turned to them at the end of the time, and you said something that I have heard you say many times in a group like this, which is there's enough talent, there's enough gifts, enough resources in this single room to change the world. And at that time, this was an encouragement to me as an artist, as a father, as a leader, trying to cultivate that sensibility among this, people that didn't believe that. But especially in the church, this whole bunch of artists, what can they do, kind of a thing, but this, as you showed us tonight, I mean, that was not something that you would just say to encourage people.
Christianity started with 12 untrained, rather bumbling guys, one of whom immediately bailed. You can change the world, through dedication, faith, effort, working in the cause of truth. I'm really old-fashioned. I believe that there's such a thing as beauty. That beauty is, in a sense, one of the ways that we look into the heart of existence and see the order of the universe, the order of our lives, which means that beauty is truth. Truth, beauty. And I think that if you can combine the arts in the cause of truth, it's immensely powerful. And beauty, art, I think transcends class differences, political differences, age differences, and makes us acknowledge our common humanity, our common world, our common, what's the right word? Posture to eternity, to mortality, to meaning. And as Christians, we have forgotten, for the most part, how to do this. No wonder, we're in a sense losing traction. We're trying to argue entirely on an analytical, a theological, a conceptual, an abstract level. People don't lead their lives through abstraction. People don't come to God through argumentation. They come experientially. And I'm not even talking about even using arts, for conversion or whatever. But what art has the power to do is to awaken us to the fullness of our humanity, to make us remember things, to make us alert to our own existence. If we are sufficiently alert to our own existence, if we, in a sense, live in some kind of harmony and consonance with truth, we're all going to be going in the right direction. Maybe by different paths, maybe at different speeds. But I think it's impossible. When, Dostoevsky, and this is a very famous, misunderstood quote or mysterious quote, beauty will save the world. He's not saying, that it's a political program, a theological program, a social program that will do this. What I think Dostoevsky is saying is that unless we provide society, young people, voters, with a vision of a society, of an existence which is beautiful, nothing else really matters. That vision of, in a sense, what is beautiful and true and just will bring us toward it. Otherwise, it's just all open for argumentation.
Thank you.